Eve Brennan, an upstanding, successful Irish guard, takes on an old case of uncovering the identity of a corpse found in the Bog of Allen in rural Ireland in 1976, while helping her dad recuperate from a hip replacement nearby in the village of Carbury. She finds that the circumstances of the old case file turning up on her boss's desk extremely suspicious. With her ex, Kieran, another career guard, they discover that the identity of what the press referred to at the time as the girl in the bog. They discover the body belonged to Grace Corcoran, an 18-year-old introverted A+ student. Both Eve and Kieran find Grace's twin sister and her older brother, who reluctantly reveal the alleged suicide of Grace. The story delves back into 1970s Ireland, the family and the community that Grace belonged to, and to the circumstances that brought her to lay in a cold, damp bog. However, Eve unearths that not all is what it seems, and that not only did Grace not kill herself, but the investigation was full of procedural errors and was the subject of a police cover-up of a more nefarious plots, including cross-border gun running. The story focuses on the characters that were important to Grace, JJ in particular, the local guard who had a close connection to the Corcoran family and to Grace. It also highlights the police cover-up, the chase of the men involved in the cover-up across southern Spain, the apprehension of a key player, and the final closure for family, friends, and the local community. So I'll just read the first two chapters. It was around 9:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning when Eve had arisen from dozing on her sofa. She had her rituals, as she called them. At the weekends, she would put the kettle on, always filling it with cold water, then shower and dress before the kettle came to a boil. Her second ritual was to drink her tea slowly, ask her Google Echo to give her the summary of the news, followed by upbeat music. The slow, fast pace she found stopped her mind going into overdrive, a pattern that had plagued her life since she was 10 years of age. It was when she was in the slow pace of her drinking her tea, with her gaze out the window at the cherry blossom tree in the front garden, that she got the call that would shake up her ordered life. The display read Bernie. Eve hesitated to answer with the copious scam calls she was aware of, but yet she was reluctant to ignore it entirely. Instead, she racked her brains, trying to remember from the recesses of her mind who this Bernie was registered on her mobile. Oh, she remembered. Bernie, the new neighbour of her father down in the country. She stood up straight and answered with a strong, "Hello, how can I help you?" A typical work mode response. Bernie's reply shook Eve. "Eve, you'd better get down here as quick as you can. Your father's had a nasty fall. I've called the ambulance and they're taking him to hospital." An echo from the back from someone else said he would be taken to Naas Hospital. Eve was shaken by the abruptness and urgency of the delivery of the news, but nonetheless, she, as a Gardaí, an Irish police officer, tried to dissect the news in logical sequence and acted accordingly. She had to pack a few things in her bag, knowing that this would take a few days, and include her phone charger because phone calls would have to be made to her superiors. She would have to fill up her car with petrol for what would likely be a few journeys back and forth to the hospital from her father's house in Carbury to Naas Hospital, a journey that would take 38 minutes. The timing wasn't ideal. She was just about to start reviewing old cases that were due for closure. She was ready under 11 minutes and hit the road from her bungalow in Blanchardstown in Dublin. This was a journey that she made religiously once a month to see her father since her mother died 10 months prior. Her father did not want to consider moving from his home that he had lived in for the past 23 years to Eve's home in what he described as the smoke. He brushed off any suggestions for help, telling Eve in what she thought was a stubborn but prideful way that he was set in his ways and didn't want anyone snooping around his home. She headed straight for Naas Hospital and was directed by reception to the ward that her father was in. She glanced around the ward of 4 people for her father, but only saw a gaunt man who looked as if he was not long for this life. A more thorough investigation revealed that it was her father. She looked around in panic, trying to find the father she remembered, the ruddy face of a farmer and not this ghost in the bed. She approached slowly, more to gain time to compose herself while holding back the tears that were threatening to spring from her eyes. "Hello, Da. I hear you had a bit of a fall. Out breakdancing again, I believe." Eve always approached her father in this way, with a comical undertone, understating the obvious. His reply was not the usual gruff placation, but a pitiful whisper. "Will you be here, Eve?" Eve faltered to answer, not knowing whether he was talking about the next few hours or for the rest of his life. "I'm here now, Da. Do you want anything?" she asked in an assertive tone as she could muster. "That's good," was all her father could respond. He closed his eyes, content that his only daughter was by his side. Eve took the opportunity to go to the nurse's station to inquire about her father and his prognosis. A nurse on duty told Eve that her father had broken his hip in 2 places. They would operate on him on Monday morning as soon as the surgeon arrived. A replacement hip would be needed and he would then recuperate over a 2 to 3 month period. Eve took it all in from the outside and from the outside looked unfazed by this revelation, but internally her heart was beating faster. She knew that she would have to step up and help him out. The time had come for her father to concede to the help that he needed. She went back into the ward and saw that her father was asleep, looking peaceful. This was the time for her to make a call to her boss, Conor O'Leary, the chief sergeant in Coolock Station. The phone was answered after 4 rings, and given it was early in the weekend, it was understandable. Eve explained her father's predicament. Conor knew the drill, having an aunt who had a hip replacement. He was understanding and told Eve not to worry about anything. He recommended that she take off her 3 weeks holiday from last year, and as she was about to start looking at unsolved cases, he suggested that she take some files with her to look through. He said that she could make a start on them after her holiday ended and while she was taking care of her father as he recuperated at home. Eve was so grateful and visibly relieved with this arrangement. She sat for a while holding her father's hand until the discomfort of the plastic chair made her rise to stretch her limbs. As she was doing so, her father awoke. "The doctor will be here to set you right on Monday. They will repair your hip then," Eve told him. "That's grand, I suppose. I suppose I'll see you then," he said. "I'll be here, Da. I will leave you for a few hours so you can rest and I can get myself straightened out at home." "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere," he responded. Back in her Toyota Yaris, she pulled out of the car park and almost ran into an oncoming car driving in her lane. She came to a halt in time and got out to admonish the driver, but she could see that it was an elderly lady looking confused and decided to drop it. She waved her on and drove down to Carbury to her childhood home. A sense of dread generally came once she passed the church. It was as if she was plummeted back 20 years as a child, growing up in a house fraught with unease. When her mother was alive, she wanted to hold a tight leash on her only daughter, and Eve resisted with all her might. Any decision that took Eve away from the homestead was viewed with suspicion by her mother. One of the hardest things Eve had to do was to step out of the home and to contest what her mother wanted her to do, which was to stay exactly where she was, both physically and emotionally. Her mother exerted the type of subtle control over Eve that a Nazi officer would be proud to enforce. Control, but in the nature of what was best for Eve, because she, her mother, knew what was best, because at times Eve didn't know her own mind. Even though her mother had to relent this control when Eve firmly fled the nest and would only return on her terms, her mother still tried to domineer. However, as an adult, Eve had become better equipped to deal with the emotional blackmail. That's chapter 1. Chapter 2. Okay. Stepping across the door threshold, Eve was hit with the smell of rotting cabbage. She saw it on the floor and deducted that her father was about to serve up his dinner when he fell. She made swift work of cleaning up the small kitchen. She looked at the fridge and found some cheese in the bread box that contained brown soda bread. She didn't have the energy for anything else elaborate, even though her culinary skills were legendary in university. Bread and cheese and a strong cup of tea was just the ticket, along with a packet of potato chips and cheese and onion crisps. The two-bed cottage was well equipped and overstuffed with her mother's knickknacks. The child of Prague, statues of which stood in what Eve thought as a teenager was in judgment, but as a young adult saw as in sympathy. She found a small one in an alcove and for the first time in many years implored Our Lady for some help and guidance. She knew it would be a long road to recovery. Her father was sprightly, but yet was getting on at 67 years of age. Eve herself at 33 in good physical condition and although unburdened with children or a husband, felt occasionally knackered after a particularly tough day at work. Ah yes, her work. Her work had become buffer against her mother's demands to visit. She could always rely on her profession as the perfect excuse to proffer when her mother became particularly difficult with her insistence on coming down to visit. It was easier to blame work than to tell her mother that she couldn't make it down every 2 weeks because she had a life of her own now, or that it would take a day or two to recover from the strain of trying to please her and the guilt of leaving her. Her mother would try to guilt-trip her by telling her that her father would be disappointed after getting in a shoulder of beef, especially for Sunday dinner. Eve became adept at deflecting by coming up with excuses of early morning starts to close up a robbery or a murder case that Conor O'Leary's team had to focus on. After her mother's sudden death, her father retired, but having a set daily routine, he grieved but managed very well on his own. They had become companionable, but it wasn't always rosy in the garden. Eve remembered the time that her mother threw a saucepan across the room, targeting her father. She didn't remember the reason, but it was just the act and the silence afterwards. Her mother was benevolent, charitable, a pillar of the community, but living up to her standards took its toll. Eve never said it, but thought at last her father had some peace now. Eve prepared her childhood bed with fresh bedding. The bedroom was left exactly how it was when Eve left 15 years earlier. She looked up at Robbie Williams' picture on the wall and sighed. Nice to see you again, Robbie. See you in the morning. Eve was awoken by cockcrow at 5 o'clock. What the bloody hell? She didn't know that Bernie the neighbour had chickens and a cock, but as she looked outside, she discovered the proud red cockerel marching proudly outside the window. How did he get out from the hen house? Bloody cock, she remarked. For the next 2 hours, she turned and twisted and couldn't get back to sleep. Finally, she got up, put the kettle on, switched the immersion heater on and took a hot shower. More strong tea and bread and cheese for breakfast was what she planned. She looked out at the new patio doors on the conservatory with her tea in hand and saw the old ruins of Carbury Castle benevolently looming over. The view always took her breath away. This frosty morning was no exception. The mist imbued the ruins with mystique. The hill surrounding the castle was the one place that she took solace in when she came for visits. She would take the winding track up the hill and lay in the crook of a folly laden with grass in the spring or summer when things got a bit tense at home. This was her safe place because she felt the hill took her in its arms and offering her sanctuary. The ruins of a castle that still refused to disappear or concede to modernity. Its stubbornness to exist and to not bow to the changes to its surroundings often marched her own obstinance at times. Thank you.